Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of our series of webinars here at the Center for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute. I'm Ken Medlock, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Alex Fleischanderl. He's with Primetals, recognized expert on all things steel and all things decarbonizing steel production. And very, very pleased to have you here with us today. I look forward to engaging in a really robust conversation about this topic, quite frankly, because, just on the heels of COP26, which was a quite a big event, there were some noticeable absences at the event, but some pretty significant agreements were made, I guess, in the context of that event. Significant commitments, really, to reduce carbon intensity of all things in economies around the world. Still a lot of things to be worked out, but that's normal in any large international negotiation. So not that surprising, really. But one of the things that often comes up in the context of decarbonization is how do you actually attack those hard to decarbonize sectors, and steel is certainly one of them. I think, as you'll mention in the context of your remarks, it's responsible for about 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So it has a sizable footprint in terms of what it means for carbon emissions around the world. So I look forward to hearing your remarks, and then we'll dive into a discussion. For those of you who are online watching, please use the Q&A function in the webinar to ask your questions. And I will get to them as they come through. Alex, with that, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Well, thanks, Ken, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to our fireside chat today. So, as already announced by Ken, I'm kicking off that with a short teaser, just covering the first couple of minutes, and then I think it's good to enter into a lively discussion. And it's all about decarbonizing steel today. So as announced, I'm from Primetals Technologies, based here in Austria. And Primetals is a group member of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Sorry, that was too quick. Let me kick off with a short summary where we stand when it comes to decarbonization of the steel industry, and we've seen numerous pledges over the last couple of months. 137 nations out of the 192 have pledged net zero. Well, with a bit of a different time span. So most of the nations by 2050, but some of them, as China and Brazil and Russia, 2060, and India just 2070. So we cover now almost 90% of the global steel by the nations that have pledged net zero. But on the contrary, only 20% of the steel production, including the 5 largest producers, have pledged net zero by 2050. So we have to break it down in a more granular way to the individual steel plants. And well, it's really quite a challenge ahead of us. If we look globally on the CO2 emissions, we are still at a starting point of 36 million tons, 36 gigatons. Sorry, that's a typo here, gigatons. In 2019, and we have to arrive at less than 10 gigaton at the end. So China is by far the leading emitter in CO2. Was just a recent announcement at the COP26. It covers 31% of the CO2 emissions, followed by the United States of America. with 14%. And what we've seen there, different mechanisms put in place. One side, the ETS, so like in the EU or some other countries. So China started also with the ETS, even on a different price level. And other countries have CO2 taxes directly implemented, and some nations, like Canada, both systems in parallel. If we break this down to steel, some facts and figures about steel: 70% of the steel production still runs on coal. That's actually what we have to move out, and still we see about on a global basis 2 tons of CO2 for each ton of steel produced. As Ken was saying in the introductory, steel production causes about 10% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, and this scope 1 and scope 2. And the demand in steel will still continue to grow. Well, this depends if we follow more a sustainable development scenario or not, but definitely we will arrive at minimum 2.1 billion tons of steel in 2050. Well, what it really requires is a massive amount of renewable electricity. And just assuming that we switch 10% of the steel production towards a hydrogen-based DRI economy, that requires 630 terawatt hours of renewable electricity for the green hydrogen. And just in comparison, Germany produced last year about 250 terawatt hours of renewable energy. So it's really massive. And it comes also with a matter of fact that green electricity and also the e-mobility will require massive amount of additional steel. So the consumption rate of steel per megawatt hour produced for wind and solar is much higher than compared to fossil type power plants. Well, that's basically a bit more on the figures and facts. So just showing that actually we still produce only 31% of the steel via electrification, so utilizing electric arc furnaces, while we will see a tremendous change here, going up to almost 60% in 2050. So this is, it requires electrification, it requires a lot of renewable power, more renewable power in the future. And we have to achieve minus 60% on the direct emissions, but also on the scope 2 emissions in a sustainable development scenario. Well, if we look what happened over the past 2 years on the political development side, I want to start with Europe. So it started exactly 2 years back when the Green Deal was announced, and it states now to achieve minus 55% CO2 reduction versus 1990. And achieving net zero in 2050. So there's an investment plan that covers 1 trillion euro over the next 10 years to boost the economy and to achieve these environmental targets. But the next steps that are actually in discussion is about ETS and CBAM. Well, the CBAM might be an instrument that really helps to avoid carbon leakage into Europe from outside. So most affected would definitely be Russia and Ukraine. There is a EU proposal draft out, so to phase out the free allocations for the hard-to-abate sector that would have a significant impact on the European steel industry. So starting from 23 till 25 with shadow reporting without any payments, just to get familiar with the system. But then starting from year 26 or the next 10 years to phase out the free allocation, so 10% reduction year by year. This would anyhow, this CBAM at the end would not solve the issue of EU export competitiveness. I put an example at the bottom line here. If we take an integrated steel mill producing 6 million ton of steel, actually emitting 1.8 ton of CO2 per ton of steel, and today has a starting point getting 80% free allocation for the CO2 emissions with the ETS price of €60. So the steel mill will have to pay 130 million euro actually. And if we look ahead into the year 35, with no free allocations and an increased ETS price of 90 euro, we end up close to 1 billion euro of payments year by year. And I believe that's the main driving force investing into the transformation for green steel. Well, on the outcomes of the COP26, some were saying there was not enough progress. At the end, I personally believe there was quite a substantial move forward. First of all, and I took here a summary from Boston Consulting that was recently published on the major outcomes on the COP26. So the Paris rule book has been completed, and I think that's essential to pave the pathway forward. We have to have a guidance on the rules, and we cover now 90% of the world in relation to the GDP. While if we look back into the year 2019 at the COP, it was just 30% of the nations. Well, there was also a move forward in deforestation. So 141 governments pledged to reverse deforestation. And methane is a relatively new topic on the agenda. But there's a large commitment of governments to focus the methane leakage and to apply the existing technologies to reduce the methane leakage. In coal, finally there was no signature of any agreement, but at least there was a commitment to halt coal fundings, starting with the year 22, and to reduce the coal consumption, and also an announcement like from China not to invest into new coal-fired power plants. And then just quickly on the finance, I think that's an essential part. So more and more of the leading financial institutions moving towards the ESG standards. So they focus on green financing for projects in the future. And essential is also that already more than 5,000 firms joined the Race to Zero campaign. So I'm pretty sure everyone is familiar with science-based targets approach. So there have been commitments by really almost all the leading industrial players, how they are going to achieve and when they are going to achieve the net carbon zero. By the way, also Mitsubishi Heavy Industry has committed to achieve carbon net zero in 2040. So if we look on the bottom lines here, unfortunately, we don't see the results yet. So we saw a decrease in the CO2 emissions in the last year, but it seems that was mainly related to the pandemics and the global lockdowns. Because this year it recovered, and actually we see almost the same figure in 21 then compared with the year 2019. So the EU made a bit of progress of 4%, the United States as well, but India increased the carbon footprint by 4%. So actually, and that's what I wanted to show on the picture on the bottom left is if we look on all the pledges in place, it seems we are more on the pathway of 2 degrees C plus on the climate warming. So we are still not in line with the target to achieve only 1.5 degrees C global warming. To move towards steel now, actually the big challenge is to transform the traditional integrated steel producing pathway, where we still stand, the best figures are 1.7 ton of CO2 per ton of steel, including already the credits from various gases and slags. And so we will see a phased approach, most likely. On the one hand, direct reduction plus electric arc furnace. And as an example here, utilizing 80% DRI, 20% scrap in the EF. So we can end up, even if we reduce with natural gas, but it reduces the carbon emissions already by 2/3. So it's an essential way forward, even we don't have the hydrogen or the green hydrogen yet at scale. The most promising route would be the recycling route. So, just melting the scrap, 100% scrap. And if we consider a low grid factor on scope 2, you see 80 gram CO2 per kilowatt hour, which is in the EU already targeted for 2030. It can be as low as 130 kilogram of CO2 only, so minus 90% over the blast furnace route. And finally, when hydrogen is available at scale, so green hydrogen, and we run direct reduction and scrap, we end up at a similar figure of less than 200 kilogram of CO2. This slide provides a lot of information and would be too time consuming, but the essential thing is, and I took this one from the International Energy Agency report 1 year back, is that it's not only switching to hydrogen and the electrification, but it's 4 pillars. The first pillar, and you see that's also the most important pillar, is material efficiency. So we have to continue the pathway for lifetime extension of the steel products. Then we have to optimize the yield from the processes with endless processes and so on. Utilize new raw material sources, focus on the recycling, and lightweight steel, so less steel per unit, and this can contribute up to 40% in the decarbonization. The second thing is technology improvement. That's our daily business already, with all the technological improvements to improve energy efficiency. with waste heat recovery and technology optimization. Also providing a big piece of cake of 21%. And then the next phase is the fuel switching, so electrification and switching to natural gas from coal, another 15%. Well, and the last piece here is the near zero emission technologies. So really the hydrogen technologies, utilizing green hydrogen and applying CCUS technologies. Well, just also opening up then for our discussion. I think the biggest issue for the steel industry is the raw material dilemma. So on iron ore and scrap. First of all, I said, well, it would be perfect to recycle scrap and to remelt it. But if we look on the top figure, we see even in 2050 just 900 million ton of scrap in the market, but we're producing more than 2 billion ton of steel. So steel will also in the long run be based on largely be based on virgin material. So we have to continue to utilize iron ore. On the other hand, and that's the figure at the bottom, if we want to go for direct reduction and we see the raw material that is utilized today in direct reduction, it's only the A-grade iron ores, the high quality iron ores, at least 65% iron, more likely 67% iron ore. But the large share that is traded, so this iron ore is much lower quality. So that's what is utilized today in sinter plants as sinter feed or pelletized for the blast furnace or lump ore with iron contents just starting at 56%, 58%, 60% like Australian iron ore. So we will have to utilize this iron ore as well in the future. And back to scrap, I missed one thing. So scrap comes always with trace elements. So we have a contradiction. On the one hand side, we go for new high-end steel grades. On the other hand, we want to use as much scrap as possible, and the scrap comes with tramp elements. So we will have to clean up scrap in the future, really to provide design scrap to meet the quality requirements for the steel. And coming back to iron ore, if we look on top right, the biggest iron ore supplier is Australia, and almost all that iron ore ends up in Asia. So you see on the left side that China takes most of the iron ore from Australia. This is rather low grade iron ore. And the figure at the left, the bottom, sees the expectation how big is the share of lower grade iron ore that will be a feed material in direct reduction in the future. So in 2019, it was zero, only the A-grade iron ore. But in 2050, we see about 50% low-grade iron ore that it will be fed to direct reduction. And that has an impact because the gangue will stay in the DRI, in the HBI, and will have to be separated in a melting furnace later on. Anyhow, we will see a really steep growth rate for direct reduction, and that I took a figure from McKinsey report and also International Energy Agency, and they provide pretty similar figures. So in 2030, we will see 170 million ton of DRI. So we are actually at 100 million. So over the next 10 years, 70 million plus, and another 200 million up to the year of 2050. So we will see really a large number of new direct reduction facilities and also feeding low-grade iron ore. So we will see a broad range of technologies, either for mini mills, but also for hybrid mills when it comes to electrification. So on the left side, the mini mills with standard furnaces, preheating furnaces that allow preheating of the scrap, high-powered electric arc furnaces that use a high share of DRI with hot feed. And on the right-hand side, various solutions to be integrated in integrated plants. So melting technologies to provide hot metal, to replace hot metal from blast furnace, but also smelting technologies for this low DR grade DRI, and very flexible furnaces. The branding at Primetals here is a fusion furnace that allows really high material charge flexibility at the end. So the location dilemma, I called this slide. That's the energy versus the steel demand. And the interesting thing is today DRI plants are usually located where the steel is consumed. Just a minor portion of HBI is traded today. But if we look to a figure, I hope it's still readable, even if it's small, but it was just released recently from Mission Possible Partnership report. And it's quite an interesting perspective, showing that almost 40% of the steel-producing nations won't have access to cheap renewable energy and cheap natural gas, or not have the possibility to for CCS. So quite difficult preconditions for the future. While around 36% of the nations will at least have access to cheap renewable energy at scale, or natural gas. So I think that will change, or could change, the picture where iron making will be located, and we see this already in the discussions with customers, especially also like in Japan. They think quite intensively. They consume iron ore from Australia mainly, but the question mark is now: shall they place the direct reduction facility in Australia, and also the electric arc furnace, the smelter in Australia, or only place the direct reduction facility there, but already place the melting furnace in Japan? And that's quite interesting. It requires different shipping rules. If you would ship that HBI having a lot of gangue requires certification of the procedure. So it has really a strong impact. And why is it interesting? Because if you ship pig iron, meaning you put the melter still in Australia, in that example, and you have to granulate it. At the end, you cool it down from 1,500 degrees to ambient and ship it then. While if you ship HBI, you cool down the DRI from 600 degrees C, so you lose 600 degrees C, and feed cold HBI into the furnace. So it's an energy efficiency question, but on the other side, also energy availability and energy price question. So quite interesting for the future. And that's the last slide. The hydrogen dilemma. So just showing, if we switch to a hydrogen economy for steel, it's most likely in the long run the best option. But to produce 1 million ton of HBI per year, it requires 70,000 ton of hydrogen per year, or around 500 megawatt electrolyzer capacity. So simply saying, it's a massive demand for green hydrogen if we really want to do that on the long term. So that's all. Back to you, Ken.
Sure, Alex. Thanks. The one thing that always strikes me when we do these types of things is really the interest in decarbonization has triggered so much availability of information about how we actually produce all of the things that most people take for granted, quite frankly. So it's always staggering to me to sort of have these kinds of conversations in that regard in particular. And I love sharing this kind of stuff with my students, to be honest with you, because it's eye-opening. I had a really basic question for you, because you actually referred to this near the end of your presentation. It's one that occurred to me right at the start, and one of the questions that came through from one of our audience members actually refers to this too. Although his question is specifically with regard to India, but you mentioned the location dilemma. And that is a really interesting one, because typically when we think about economic development and we think about the infrastructure intensity of developing economies, steel is central to that. And usually what happens is you try to maintain control of as much of that value chain as possible. So if you're going to grow and develop, the more local production you have to feed that development, the better, typically. And when we get to countries like India, or if we get to countries like China, right? I mean, what energy source do they have the most abundance of? Well, it's coal. And so it's kind of natural to see as the steel industries there grow and develop and feed the economic engines that are those countries, that coal is a central part of that. And so it really does beg the question, because it does open lots of other security dimensions, quite frankly, with regard to international trade. You mentioned Australia and Japan, right, in the example that you were using. But I wonder if you could give some thought or share some insight into exactly what a country like India, a large developing economy, is likely to do, and what sort of incentives are in place to sort of trigger change. And I will just throw this out there too, because I thought this was fascinating. Before you answer, you mentioned that, I think I wrote the figures down here somewhere. Yeah, we can get up to 76% of the targeted reduction in carbon emissions by 2050 without even going green hydrogen. It really is about materials intensity and technical efficiency and fuel switching. So this is where natural gas and even some of the blue and turquoise hydrogen, come into play. So I wonder if you could just sort of weave all of that into your answer, because I think it's a fascinating place to start the conversation.
Yeah, sure. So maybe to pick up the topic of India, China, or the developing nations anyhow, looking also in Southeast Asia and others. It's true. So if we look on India, it's largely based on coal economy, and I think it was also correct that Modi disagreed to sign a formal agreement on getting out of coal quickly, because it's simply not realistic for India. So it will take more time. But what is the way out of India? On the one hand side, we know that there will be quite steep steel demand and also increasing steel capacities in India, which is counterproductive if we want to achieve net zero. On the other hand, we see also quite ambitious plans for India to go into the renewable power sector. Even that will require time. They intend to multiply by factor quite quickly, going to renewable energy. The other thing is, and we see that already with the pilot at Tata in India, that they intend to go for CCS technology, so state-of-the-art technology to sequestrate the CCS, and also thinking about utilization of the CO2. And India for sure has also the capability to move the way forward in advanced high-strength steel. So avoiding that the increase of steel capacities is that steep. So targeting a higher end market that will come over the years. And the other thing is also, if we look into China, same thing. At least China has now said they are not going to allow for new coal-fired power plants in the future. They will finish the actual ones. But the consequence is clear, and that's not only for China. We see that now with many nations. It brings back the discussion on nuclear power and the acceptability. I just can see that this has really changed over the past 12 months. So a couple of countries are now seems to accept nuclear power again to compensate for fossil-based power plants. So I think that's on the one hand, and it's clear. If we see the massive amount of renewable power in the world, and we see the share that is provided today, that cannot come over the next 5 or 10 years. That will take decades. So we need alternative pathways on the midterm.
Yeah, that's right. You raised nuclear. I was going to ask that question because you also, in one of your slides, you showed an interesting, what I would almost call a circular conundrum, right? Because you commented that there's a lot of emphasis on moving to renewables to run either produce green hydrogen for steel production or produce green hydrogen for use to generate electricity as a mix with natural gas, electric arc furnaces, all sorts of things, right? But the interesting thing about that is as you develop all of that new infrastructure, you need lots of steel. And it sort of creates an interesting dilemma because not only do you need steel for that infrastructure, but you need steel for other things as well. And you need the electricity for other things as well. And so it creates a really, I think, an interesting challenge for the, all renewables all the time discussion. And, nuclear is obviously the most energy dense form of electricity. And it's also on when it's on, right? And there's no concern about intermittency with nuclear power typically. So do you have any insights into, you mentioned a couple of countries have sort of reversed course on the future of nuclear, but do you have any insights into where nuclear could potentially play a bigger role in steel production specifically, if there's any ongoing conversations along those lines?
Yeah, well, I see that the discussion in Europe is quite diverse. So Germany most likely is not going to change the mind. They announced to get out of nuclear and say they continue that pathway. On the contrary, France is taking exactly an opposite role in that.
And real quick, isn't the EU presidency shifting to France in a few months, right? Isn't that correct? So, I mean, do you think that'll have any role in the tenor in the EU around nuclear?
Yeah, I think so. So, I mean, we've seen now quite a couple of important change in thinking from the Commission. I would say the first one is more acceptance to nuclear power. The second one is if we look into Hydrogen Europe, before there was quite a strong commitment that only green hydrogen is accepted. So now it's clear that at least for the next decades, we talk about low carbon hydrogen, meaning also allowing for natural gas pyrolysis in what form, ever catalytic or plasma, and producing Turkish hydrogen. So I think it's recognized that the most important thing is low carbon hydrogen at scale as quick as possible. And if this comes from natural gas with black carbon, it's welcomed as well. And the same is for the energy. So it's obvious that we need this massive amount of low carbon power, and that can come just by renewables or nuclear power.
So you mentioned the pandemic, and I'm going to kind of ask this question so I can ask another one. So I want your thoughts on this first. But you mentioned the pandemic. It obviously had a big impact on emissions as well as on energy consumption. I think it would be useful if you could share what you understand it meant for steel production as well, because one of the things we've noticed, and as you pointed out, emissions jumped right back up in 2021 to where they were pre-pandemic in 2019. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, yes, emissions drop, but we can't turn over capital stocks in 12 months. So as soon as the economy starts to move again, we put all the same capital back to work, and emissions, that footprint jumps pretty dramatically. But what was the impact of the pandemic on steel production? Did it open up any real opportunities for radical change in the steel sector, or is it still going to be a long process?
No, personally, I think it really a box, and it seems that the steel industry has really collectively got it that. There will be a transformation. And if we see now the announcements of many of the leading steel producers, I think there's no way back. You cannot announce this project for the transformation and then simply not follow the pathway. Maybe we see a delay by 1 or 2 years. Pretty obvious. All the boundary conditions has to be set. If we talk about carbon contracts for difference or the CBAM or whatever, it's clear that we need this planning, or the steel producer requires that planning security. But they will happen. And so when I said the 5 leading steel producers from the capacity-wise, I mean, so that includes ArcelorMittal, but also Baowu Group in China. They have really a roadmap how they are going to decarbonize, and also with concrete plans how they are going to do it, not just putting a figure there. So therefore, I believe the pandemic was really a game changer. So all together. For sure, it started with this Green Deal announcement. An important milestone was also getting back the U.S. with the Biden administration. Also now the agreement between U.S. and China to collaborate on the decarbonization topics. I think these are all pieces of a puzzle that fits together, and so the transition in the sector is going to happen.
Okay. You just mentioned the Biden administration, and there was actually a question from one of our audience members regarding the infrastructure bill that was recently passed, and whether or not you think it will have any material impact on steel production in the United States and various decarbonization plans that have been outlined. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think U.S. had a head start because they have already some decades back decided to go the pathway for mini mills. So if we compare the share of integrated mills and mini mills compared to other regions in the world, US is definitely ahead of others. So they are producing most likely the lowest carbon steel already today. US has also the advantage having the shale gas, so also the opportunity, at least in the first phase, to switch to direct reduction with the remaining blast furnace capacities there. And also the plans, if we look on the large announcement like in Texas offshore for CCS projects, altogether, I think the US has quite good boundary conditions to continue that pathway to decarbonize steel. So, I wouldn't see any deindustrialization in respect to steel in the US today.
Okay. So I had a couple of other questions, and actually one of them I'll just ask you because it's an interesting question. I've never seen, in all of the discussions I've seen around pathways, the one thing that never seems to get brought up is cost. And so I wonder if you could share some insights with regard to, if we're looking towards 2050 versus how steel is produced today. What are some of the estimates that are out there with regard to what the cost of steel production will look like if all of these different things do come to pass?
Yeah, I just read also a couple of interesting figures in this Mission Possible Partnership report, and they were also looking into what are the costs the decarbonization comes for steel, and it's clear if we look on the costs today, and we have quite a challenge actually. If we look on the energy prices, so we saw just in Europe a threefold energy price if we compare to summer just a couple of months back. So we talk now about electrification, but if the power price is at that level, it comes with significant additional cost. Clearly, we have seen the same rise on the natural gas in Europe. So it's always a little bit looking in a crystal ball. If we look into 2050, nobody knows what are the energy prices. So if we looked in the recent reports, everyone was forecasting energy prices are going to drop, right? And now we have threefold in energy prices. So it's quite difficult forecast, and that's what I meant also with this planning security. I think that's pretty difficult for steel producers to make a decision to make an investment at a $1 billion level for the next 30, 40 years, and not being clear on that significant costs on power, gas, and so on.
So that actually raises another really interesting question. It gets into really energy security at a national level, but also asset security at the firm level. When you just mentioned making investments that are long-lived right now, and arguably a lot of those large investments will be occurring in developing nations around the world, right? Areas where coal is still sort of king, right? Is there I don't know if you can comment, is there a viable pathway to build into something that is utilizing what is now cheap and plentiful, but be able to transition those facilities in a reasonable way over the next 10, 15 years to alternative fuels? So, for example, if I build something to use coal today, what is the likelihood of being able to use something else 10 years from now?
I think still think if we look on the forecast on metallurgical coal, it will significantly drop over the next 2-3 decades. But anyhow, we will require metallurgical coal, and if we look on the cost competitiveness on the one hand side, it will depend on the alternative energy prices, but it will depend as well on the carbon price, how really the carbon price on a global basis. So I just was stating, I was looking today on the ETS in Europe, and the ETS price is now 74 euro per ton of CO2. It's an unbelievable high. So it's a peak price. And how will the carbon price develop on a global basis? In Asia, including carbon taxes. And at the end, we see that hydrogen costs of today, so green hydrogen, whatever we want to take, let's take $5 per kilogram. We know if we compare it to coal today, it would require around $1 per kilogram of hydrogen, or even less, 70 US cent. So we will. Do we ever achieve that price level? The forecast is yes. So with the scale and the renewable energy prices coming down again, we will come close to 1 or 1.5 US dollars per kilogram of hydrogen. And if we see then carbon tax, I think we will see a competitive alternative solution to the actual pathways.
Okay. So you mentioned we got time just for a couple more questions, and I want to ask both of them actually. You mentioned in your remarks about the quality of iron ore falling over time, and that's something that we've actually heard before. So, but one question I have with regard to reduction in iron ore quality is, what does that mean for the energy intensity of a given amount of high quality steel production?
Well, it's quite an interesting topic, I would say, and that came just across over the past 12 months, I would say, that customers are now thinking more and more utilizing these low quality iron ores in direct reduction. First of all, I think today the dominant technology is shaft technology, so either Vitrex or MHI HYL technology. But we see for the lower grade iron ores, if we talk about sinter feed or even really fine and ultra fine iron ore, we will require fluidized bed technologies. So it seems that we will see kind of revival. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, we have seen these fluidized bed technologies. Two of these projects also executed by Primetals, so in Australia and Venezuela with finer red. And we believe we will require that technologies in fluidized bed stage. The second thing is, well, if we utilize this low-grade iron ores, we have DRI with 10% gangue or even more. So we will have to separate this gangue in form of slag in a melted technology. And now a really large number of steel producers recently are discussing about this smelter technology. So reducing electric arc furnace pretty close to a submerged arc furnace, as we know this furnace for the ferroalloy industry, feeding that low quality DRI and producing then kind of pig iron that is either granulated and traded or fed directly as hot metal into the existing BOF. And producing still a high amount of slag, but that slag can be pretty close to today's blast furnace slag, and that will help also the cement industry. And that's an important point I would like to stress. Because Ken, you mentioned, renewable energy requires a lot of steel. It doesn't require only a lot of steel. It requires even more cement and concrete. We know that the 1 ton of cement clinker comes again with around 700 kilograms of CO2. So I think this gross industry approach is pretty much important. So they are lacking with secondary materials. So they will miss the fly ash from the coal-fired power plants. They will have a lack from blast furnace sand when we blow down the blast furnaces. So I think that's an alternative pathway where direct reduction feeding low quality ore plus a smelter producing a kind of cement clinker slag that is might be quite attractive in certain regions in the world. And I believe we will see quite a number of these processes mid-term.
Yeah, it's an interesting. It presents some interesting opportunities to generate new sort of cross-industry alliances, if you will, right? The ability to actually leverage efficiencies across platforms. So that's definitely interesting. So one last question I want to ask you, and it really has to do with just kind of like the future of steel. It's almost a pontification, really, that I'd love you to sort of engage in. But there's a lot of discussion about, and there has been for years, but it seems to be ramping up, particularly on the back of, efforts to move to a hydrogen economy, but advanced carbon materials replacing steel in certain applications. Do you see that as a viable substitution opportunity in certain regions of the world anytime in the near future, or is that still something that's a couple of decades away?
Advanced carbon materials.
Advanced carbon materials, yeah. So the idea is you can take a carbon byproduct from a pyrolysis reaction if you're making hydrogen, with methane, for example, and use that solid carbon to make all sorts of advanced materials that can, in some instances, replace steel. But admittedly, it's incredibly expensive and only doable in a lab at the moment. But there's a lot of interest in it. So I wonder if you've thought much about that.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to address more the alternative of biochar. If we talk about alternative coal material, I would say, at least a certain share can be a bio-based material that we do also gasification, that we do replace PCI coal by charcoal, like ArcelorMittal in Ghent is doing with used furnitures. For sure, this has just a limited capability because we don't want to deforestate, so we can't just use recycled wood there. If we talk about black carbon, that we produce low carbon hydrogen, Turkey's hydrogen. And I think there's quite a good showcase in Nebraska with monolith, right? And this is really high quality carbon that goes today into the tire industry. For sure, if we scale the technology worldwide, at a certain point of time, there will be saturation for the tire market, and then we will have access of this high quality carbon. So, I wouldn't say they see that carbon will go again in the steel industry to burn it. So that wouldn't make sense at the end. It's not a low carbon.
Oh yeah. No, I wasn't saying to burn it. It's to make new material, right? Advanced carbon materials.
Yeah. Exactly. So that's definitely an alternative that is still in an early stage. But I believe we shall put there a lot of effort to find alternative materials. However, I don't fear that these materials will replace steel. It will always be a limited alternative for steel as a material.
Interesting. Okay. Well, we are up against it on time, Alex. As always, it's great to see you, and thank you for your excellent presentation and very insightful remarks. I think we got to, in sort of different ways, all of the questions that came through from our viewers. I'll take another look through, and if we didn't, I'll try to respond and loop you in if needed. But thank you so much, and to everybody that's been watching, stay safe, stay healthy, and happy holidays. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah.